Thank you everyone for joining this webinar on Uyghur forced labor in food and agriculture. We're joined by Daniel Murphy, who has spent over a decade collaborating with civil society, industry and government to advance decent labor practices in fishing and seafood sectors. He has leading expertise on Thailand. With a background in investigations, research and advocacy, his current focus is on China. He's been reporting on state-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region as a journalist since 2023. His work has been published in The New Yorker, Politico, Le Monde, Sky News, and other media outlets, as well as civil society organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace, Oxfam, and others. So I'm going to pass the stage on to Daniel Murphy.
Hi, thanks very much, James. Nice to be here with you. I am going to talk today about state-imposed forced labor in China's food and agricultural supply chains, and in particular, I'm going to present findings from an investigation into animal feed that I worked on for the last couple of years, and that was published just this last summer. The investigation examined how cotton produced under conditions of forced labor in Xinjiang is still entering global supply chains despite sanctions by being converted into animal feed rather than textiles and garments. Of course, there's been a significant amount of attention on those two manufacturing sectors in relation to cotton. Animal feed, as it sounds like, is the stuff we feed various animals raised in farms for meat, seafood, and dairy. The investigation I worked on traced these supply chains from Xinjiang through China's agro, biotech, and livestock sectors to multinational food brands, including KFC and McDonald's, and onward to retail and food service sectors in the UK. It combined social media analysis, review of official Chinese reports, corporate disclosures, trade data, alongside expert interviews. So let's just take a minute to get a bird's eye view on state-imposed forced labor in relation to cotton. Around 20% of the world's cotton originates in Xinjiang, the Uyghur region, where 90% of China's cotton is grown. And evidence released over a decade now has shown what you might call a structurally coercive environment at scale. Independent research has characterized work in Xinjiang cotton harvesting in particular as subject to widespread state-organized mobilization, with local authorities coordinating recruitment, enforcing discipline, monitoring compliance. And Chinese sources, official government sources, indicate over 500,000 people mobilized into cotton picking in a single year of 2018. So this indicates a large-scale programmatic system rather than isolated pattern of abuse. And in the last couple of years, there's been some really interesting research showing that hand-picked cotton in particular presents the highest risk. So despite official claims of mechanization by the Chinese government, cotton harvesting in southern Xinjiang in particular is still primarily, or in fact overwhelmingly, I think it's something like 97% hand-picked. And that, i.e. the southern areas of the Uyghur region, are precisely where the risk of coercion is assessed as being most severe due to the labor mobilization program and state oversight. So my investigation drew on first-hand videos posted to China's version of TikTok, Douyin, that show Uyghurs hand-picking cotton. In one case, a woman filmed herself picking cotton, and then was transferred by a Chinese government entity through the labor transfer program nearly 2,000 miles away to work in a factory in Hubei province. And that labor transfer pipeline outside of the Uyghur region to factories in eastern China is something I focused a lot of my work on in the last couple of years, but we're mainly talking right now about work within the Uyghur region. Videos that were posted to social media also showed children, in one case as young as 7, picking cotton, and these are dozens of posts from recent years. And experts that I spoke to in the course of the investigation who reviewed that material indicated that it represented pretty explicit violations of both Chinese labor law and international child labor conventions. So what is the industry that I was looking at beyond the cotton fields themselves and the cotton harvesting operations? So since the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act came into force in the United States, which has obviously blocked or at least obstructed the entry of Xinjiang cotton into global markets, we've seen, and this is what my investigation focused on, a diversion of at least byproduct from cotton harvesters in Xinjiang into the animal feed sector, which has allowed Xinjiang-linked raw material to enter global supply chains in essentially a less visible form. And this diversion has supported a national level food security strategy, which has been pursued by Beijing for a number of decades now, which sees a substitution of product of raw material like soy, like corn, that's typically used as an ingredient in animal feed for cottonseed, which is a byproduct of the cotton harvesting process. And this has real geopolitical consequences. The strategy, as I mentioned, the food security strategy, is partly designed, or in fact in no small part designed, to reduce dependence, a really critical dependence on agricultural imports from the US, and most specifically soybean imports, from which of which China imports an enormous volume from its geopolitical rival, the United States. So cottonseed, as I mentioned, is a byproduct of the cotton harvesting process. We're not talking about the material that makes the fibers. We're talking about a process which yields, we're talking about the process through which those fibers are extracted, which yields a byproduct, cottonseed. And that, as a raw material, cottonseed has a variety of uses actually, but its use as an animal feed has historically been really limited by the fact that it contains this toxic compound called gossypol. And in recent years, literally in the last 2 to 3 years, Chinese biotechnology, a bunch of scientists in a couple of provinces, and actually located in research teams located in northern Xinjiang as well, have developed new forms of biotechnology that allow them to use a microbial fermentation process to essentially detoxify that cottonseed and actually make it suitable for poultry, pigs, fish, cattle, and actually not just suitable. It's it's high protein feed stuff or ingredient for animal feed, which makes it a particularly valuable and suitable substitute for soybean and other inputs like corn. So alongside this, we've also seen new techniques. I mentioned the research team in northern Xinjiang. This is what they were focused on. We've also seen new techniques, biotechnological techniques arise in the last couple of years that are also fermenting cotton straw, so other byproducts of the cotton harvest, using similar technology, not the exact same approach, but different kinds of microbes and different kinds of fermentation processes to also turn cotton waste into high-value, protein-rich feed inputs. So the national cottonseed market in China was valued at around about $4 billion in 2023. It's projected to grow to $7 billion by 2028, and state policy across the country actively encourages farmers, feed manufacturers, and large agri and food firms to replace inputs like soybean and corn with cottonseed, and indeed some other alternatives. And that cottonseed processing industry is concentrated in Xinjiang. I know that Patricia's going to address some of her remarks to tomatoes and the recent findings there, especially from a BBC investigation published last year. And actually, one of the players in that BBC investigation, it's a tomato paste producer, Xinjiang Guangdong. They just opened a cottonseed fermentation facility in Xinjiang a couple of years ago. But the leading processor is a company called Chengguang Biotech. They handle north of $700 million worth of cottonseed annually through a Xinjiang-based subsidiary. And Chengguang Biotech was sanctioned by the US in 2023 under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act for forced labor links, for forced labor in its other Xinjiang agricultural operations, primarily related to peppers. So cottonseed products from Xinjiang, according to the research that I did, which drew on a lot of company disclosures published to stock exchange registries, etc. It showed that cottonseed products from Xinjiang are supplied to major feed and food companies. In the case of Chengguang Biotech, the one I just mentioned, the largest producer, their customers for Xinjiang cottonseed derived feedstock. So that's a bit of a mouthful. So their customers for the fermented cottonseed, which is then able to be used as a feed ingredient, as an ingredient in animal feed. Those customers include Uyghur Carrier, which is a large Chinese agri company that's owned by Archer's Daniel Midland, which is one of the largest food and feed companies in the world, one of the ABCD, the big four. Wen's Food Group, which is I think I'll just say one of China's largest swine producers, pig meat producers. Guangdong Hide, again an enormous aqua feed producer, so they're manufacturing feeds that will be fed to shrimp, etc. And the Thai multinational Zhilin Bokban CP. Now, in CP's supply chain in particular, we see forced labor at several points. We see it in the cotton harvesting, which I mentioned. We see it in cottonseed processing. We see it in poultry seed processing, poultry meat processing as well, and that's using ethnic minority workers transferred to work sites outside of the Uyghur region. So CP operates feed mills in Xinjiang. One is a joint venture in Urumqi with the XPCC, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp. State media reports that Uyghur workers were transferred from southern Xinjiang to that feed mill in the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, as I mentioned, my research into the labor transfer program as it relates to movements outside of the Uyghur region has shown that CP also owns and operates poultry processing operations that are taking workers from the Uyghur region through government deployment. And in their CP's plant in Hubei province, we know it supplies chicken to McDonald's and KFC. in particular. Another producer, actually there were about 7 other poultry producers that I identified that were participating in the labor transfer program, and these were located across multiple eastern Chinese provinces. But among those 7, another one was Dachan Foods. To give you a sense of scale, Dachan and CP combined, they slaughter almost 1 billion chickens annually. So they're really big operations, and they both supply KFC in China, which was one of the important supply chain related findings of this investigation, that China doesn't export a lot of chicken, poultry meat to the US, but significant volumes of poultry are shipped to markets like the EU and Japan. And this work on the poultry sector broadly, and kind of moving from animal feed into poultry specifically here, it built on some earlier work I did in 2023, which showed similar exposure for global retail, food service, and public procurement supply chains that are sourcing seafood from China. And that investigation found that since 2018, around about 1,000 Uyghurs were transferred to seafood processing facilities in Shandong province, which is a major global hub for seafood that's exported around the world. Now, seafood supply chains, like a lot of agricultural or food supply chains, are complex, but in seafood in particular, there are multiple handoffs between vessels, processors, cold storage, exporters, farms, and that can make labor concerns or just the supply chain itself quite difficult to trace. We found imports from plants implicated in the labor transfer program that were exporting cod, pollock, shrimp, salmon, squid, crab, that were then sold in major supermarkets and by large food service companies in both the US and Europe. And in fact, records that we reviewed showed that over a period of 5 years, the US government had spent more than $200 million on seafood purchases from China that were exposed to factories using Uyghur labor. And this was seafood going to public schools, to military bases, to prisons. I'm noting the time, so I'm gonna maybe wrap up a bit on some of the reflections from these 3 different but obviously highly related investigations into animal feed, poultry, and seafood. I think they show that forced labor can persist at multiple stages of these complex food supply chains, and that really challenges current regulatory and corporate due diligence frameworks. But it's also not a problem that's isolated to China. So CP, the Thai multinational that I was referring to earlier, is actually a company I'm very familiar with, having worked for many years on forced labor in Thailand's fishing sector, as James noted in his introduction. And their CP, the Thai company, faces an eerily similar challenge, where primarily Burmese and Cambodian men working on Thai fishing vessels in conditions of forced labor are supplying fish that are then used as a raw material to make animal feed ingredients for Thai shrimp, for feed that is fed to Thai shrimp, which is a major global export industry. So that's actually a very similar challenge to the one that I identified in relation to Xinjiang cotton and animal feed. And for cotton seeds, these findings, really underscore an urgent need for business to grapple with how to get visibility over where feed ingredients in their supply chain, especially feed ingredients linked to cotton, are actually coming from. And here the scientific testing that is frequently used for testing Xinjiang origin cotton in garments and textiles, it just doesn't work, because once you mix the cotton seed meal with animal feed, once you mix it into animal feed with other ingredients, the forensic fingerprint that tells you the cotton's origin, the tests for that essentially become extremely difficult. But I'll leave you with on a last thought, which is that, you know, I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't an insurmountable challenge in terms of the traceability, in terms of understanding as a business or as a public procurement actor, how to trace the raw material in your supply chain. It's not an insurmountable challenge. Many companies run traceability programs for soy, for palm oil, for fish meal, for other feed ingredients. It's just that cotton is currently overlooked in those systems, and I think my recent work is showing that really needs to change. So I'll leave it there. I'm noting the time, and back to you, James. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for presenting some of your research and findings, and I'm sure we'll return to it in some questions, especially on the traceability and the overcoming this horrendously, as you said, overlooked issue. But we're going to introduce our next speaker, who we're honoured to have with us, Patricia Carrier, who works on private sector engagement and policy advocacy for the Coalition to End Forced Labour in the Uyghur Region. She has worked on modern slavery in the UK for over 10 years and previously managed the Modern Slavery Registry at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. She's also a US and UK qualified attorney. So Patricia, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Perfect. Thanks. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here to speak to you today. So I'll speak more about, as Daniel noted, tomatoes and other people's research, as the coalition doesn't conduct research itself, but we really rely on other people's research to do our engagement with the private sector, which includes businesses, investors, and industry associations, as well as support our advocacy work, which at the moment is really focused on getting the UK to implement a forced labor import ban. And I'll speak to that more later on in my remarks. But just to give a brief introduction to the coalition for those who aren't super aware of who we are. We are a global coalition really led by our Uyghur colleagues and Uyghur-led organizations who form part of our steering committee. We have one very clear call to action to all businesses and all investors, which is to exit the Uyghur region at every level of the supply chain. So this would require companies to map and trace their entire supply chain down to raw material level and address any exposure and any links to the Uyghur region. So this includes immediately ceasing to source directly from the region, and then also to address any suppliers or sub-suppliers that may be sourcing from the region. So any indirect sourcing that you may have, we would call on companies to address those links as well. And I do want to point out that our call is for an immediate exit from the region. And in most cases, forced labor advocates would call for a responsible disengagement from problematic business relationships and as a last resort. And this is to ensure that workers aren't left in an even worse situation from big brands and companies moving out. We would also call for remediation and for companies to take steps to prevent forced labor from happening again. So addressing problematic business models, purchasing practices, etc. This is all part of human rights due diligence that companies are expected to undertake under various supply chain regulation, but also the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and the OECD guidelines. But I think as Daniel has already explained a bit, in the Uyghur region, the forced labor that is being perpetrated against Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim majority people is imposed by the state. It is part of state policy. It is pervasive and it is systemic, and it takes place within an environment that is very repressive and where other really egregious human rights abuses are happening. And so in this context, human rights due diligence isn't going to work effectively. There's just simply no way to mitigate, prevent, or remediate the forced labor that is being perpetrated as part of the state policy. So this is why we call for immediate disengagement from that region. And as Daniel pointed out, and as much of his research has shown over the past year, this also does apply to labor transfers outside of the region. So we would expect companies to try to identify whether suppliers outside the region are participating in labor transfers, and then address that risk and ultimately disengage if that is what is needed. So to get to tomatoes, which is what I was asked to speak about today, we've already heard a bit about this BBC investigation that was published almost exactly 1 year ago from today. But even as early as 2021, U.S. Customs and Border Protection issued a withhold release order against tomato products, including raw materials, canned tomato sauce, tomato seeds. And this WRO also covered cotton as well. So this was for products produced or harvested in the Uyghur region. So these goods were not allowed to be imported into the USA. A year later, when the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was passed in the US, the 3 priority areas for enforcement under that legislation was, again, tomatoes, cotton, and then also silica or polysilicon products, so mainly targeting solar panels. And the extent to which companies responded to the WRO, or the fact that tomatoes were a priority area for the UFLPA, I don't think was particularly vocal or explicit. In fact, a lot of the sort of corporate response around Uyghur forced labor is very muted. So companies don't tend to speak very publicly or loudly about this issue for various reasons, including fear of boycotts, but also fear for staff on the ground in country, etc. So this is an issue that we really have a hard time getting public statements or explanations from companies about. But fast forward to 2024 with the BBC investigation, which basically found that using a number of different types of methodologies and approaches, found that about 17 products, tomato paste products, mostly sold in the UK and Germany, contained tomatoes from China, and specifically from the Uyghur region. And the BBC did undertake some of this testing, DNA or isotopic testing that was already mentioned, to try to identify whether these products did have tomato product or paste or tomatoes or originating in the Uyghur region. I believe they looked at a total of 64 different products, and it was 17 that were found to contain Uyghur-based tomatoes. And at this point, I think it's important to note that there were products that were being sold in the US that were also tested, and those products were found to only have Italian tomatoes. So however credible or not you find this testing, I think it's an important thing to note, and I'll come back to this later on in my remarks, that the US bound products did not contain any Chinese tomatoes. The BBC investigation also interviewed dozens of people who had witnessed or experienced forced labor in the region in tomato harvesting over the past 16 years. So this link to forced labor in the tomato industry was very much supported by a credible evidence base. Around the same time that this BBC investigation came out, research by Adrian Zenz was also published, and that looked at a number of agricultural products, including tomatoes, peppers, marigolds, and stevia, among others. And that research also found that forced labor was being used in the harvesting and production of these products. And not only that, the research showed that Uyghurs had had to surrender their land to large commercial operators, usually state-owned, and then they were made to work on that land. And I think it's important to note that the state-imposed forced labor that is being perpetrated against Uyghur people in the region, as I said earlier, usually is enabled by or enables other egregious human rights harm. So in this case, we have land being taken away from people, and then those people having to participate in state-mandated work on that land that was just taken from them. And there's various other ways in which other human rights harms are able to be perpetrated against the Uyghurs as a result of the state-imposed forced labor, or is enabling the forced labor as well. And we've written quite a bit about this intersection of egregious human rights abuse. If you would like to learn more, I can share that with you later. I think it's interesting in this particular case that the response by companies that were named in this investigation, which included Tesco, Waitrose, Morrisons, and others, was swift, and it was quite loud. And the responses by the brands really did vary quite a bit. So Tesco immediately stopped, I think, sourcing from problematic suppliers while they did their, while they looked into the issue. Waitrose and Morrison said that they had done their own testing and didn't find any evidence of Chinese tomatoes. Lidl was interesting in that they did acknowledge the possible presence of Chinese tomatoes in their products sold in Germany. And this was through a sub-supplier about 3 tiers down that was sanctioned by the US government in December of 2023 for forced labor. I think that in particular is interesting because when we speak to companies and they talk about how difficult it is to identify these exposures to the Uyghur region or this forced labor, this example is interesting because, of course, it shouldn't be that difficult to identify a sanctioned company, especially as it was sanctioned in 2023, so not long before the investigation. So if companies did made a little bit more of an effort, the information is there for them to be able to identify some of their exposure points to this state-imposed forced labor. We haven't heard much from these brands in terms of what they're doing to address this risk in their supply chain or this exposure, but that is usually the case for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Companies simply do not talk about this issue very publicly, but based on private conversations, we know that they usually are very much working quite hard to address that risk. And so fast forward to some media reporting last month, including in the Financial Times, which found that China's exports of tomato paste to Italy and Western Europe have pretty much collapsed. So there has been a pretty swift exit away from Uyghur region tomatoes and tomato paste and products. Where the alternative sourcing is coming from, I'm not sure, but I think the takeaway is that once those brands were named, they acted quite quickly to exit the region and find sourcing elsewhere. While I would like to say the coalition had a hand to play in this sort of shift in supply chains, I don't think that was necessarily the case. We did work quite closely with an MP who did raise this issue in Parliament. But I think there was a number of other reasons why this story got so much traction when it did. I think part of it is that we're talking about a consumer product that is widely used across a very wide and broad consumer market. Everyone uses tomato paste and tomato products. So I think it just really hit hard with these food retailers and their consumer base. I think another interesting angle that sort of hit home for some people was this mislabeling of the products. So all the products that were named and targeted in this investigation were packaged and labeled as Italian tomatoes. And so the fact that, many of them were made with Chinese tomatoes, and then, forced labor Uyghur Region tomatoes was also something that caused a bit of reputation damage, which was an interesting angle that we don't always have in these cases and in these investigations. And I think also this shift in sourcing, which is evident from these articles in the FT, et cetera, also show that unlike other sectors or products where a shift to alternative sourcing might be a bit more challenging or difficult, obviously companies can find tomatoes in various other places. It might be more expensive, et cetera, but tomatoes can be found elsewhere, which is not necessarily the case for certain other raw materials where alternative sourcing isn't so easy to identify, or for companies dealing in products that have very complex supply chains. And I'm thinking about automotive and electric vehicles. If you read the driving force report by Sheffield Hallam University, I think, car makers have tens of thousands of supply chains. And so when you have many that are tainted or exposed to Uyghur forced labor, it becomes very difficult to try and shift those out of these problematic areas. So I think just to sort of talk about what the coalition has done with this research is really use it as a case study to show why we very much need a forced labor import ban in the UK. We have the Modern Slavery Act, but that is pretty much completely ineffective as a piece of law, but it's certainly going to be ineffective for state imposed forced labor for all the reasons we've already discussed. And with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US and the forthcoming EU forced labor regulation coming in 2027, it just means that the UK will become even more of a dumping ground for tainted goods when Uyghur forced labor made products aren't able to be imported into the US, but also not be imported into the EU as well. And so we're really using case studies and investigations like this one to engage with policymakers and others to really highlight why the UK needs to protect its markets from tainted goods and implement a forced labor import ban. And again, I'll just point to the fact that the goods that were tested as part of this investigation that were meant to go to the US did not have Chinese tomatoes in them. And so I think that really reinforces this idea that import bans can really change corporate behavior, in that companies will put in the effort to map and trace their supply chain, but also really avoid the risk of having their goods potentially stopped at the border, which is hugely problematic and very costly, especially when it comes to perishable goods. You don't want to pay for your tomatoes to be stored while they're being assessed for compliance with an import ban, but also those goods could very well go bad while you're waiting. The other thing that the BBC investigation noted that I think is relevant for discussions of import bans is that the tomatoes were entering the EU or getting to Italy via train, via Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. So traveling through those three countries, they eventually made their way into Italy. So fairly easily, which just goes to show that these goods can enter into the EU and then into the UK quite easily. So there needs to be a legal mechanism that stops these goods from being imported. One further thing I'd like to note on that point is recent research by the Uyghur Human Rights Project. They published some research in July, I believe it was, or this summer, and then they updated that research just last month, showing that there's a rise in cargo flights coming directly from the Uyghur region into the UK and Europe. And so this is sort of another way that the government is getting its products into the UK markets and into the European markets directly. and sort of creating these direct routes to get their goods into the markets. And this research showed that there are cargo flights increasing into the UK, including into London, Birmingham, Bournemouth, Cardiff, Nottingham, and other locations. So this has all been happening within the past couple of years or so. So I would argue that this is very much a concerted effort to get these goods directly into these markets, understanding that there's increasingly going to be legislation that will try to stop these goods from coming in. So I'll just sort of start to wrap up by saying that our work is very much focused on trying to get an import ban into the UK, but also a one that has a rebuttable presumption that any goods made in whole or in part in certain locations, such as the Uyghur region or places like Turkmenistan, we can presume that those have been made with forced labor. And then the burden is put onto the importer to show that those goods have not in fact been made with forced labor if they come from these particular locations. I will note that this presumption has not been rebutted in any cases in the US thus far. So again, I think it's a really important mechanism to include in an import ban if there is going to be one here in the UK. And there does seem to be support among parliamentary committees and certain MPs, and there just seems to be quite a bit of momentum for that currently. So we hope that continues. And, you know, there's a lot of research out there that shows that import bans do have quite a bit of impact, more than other corporate accountability and supply chains regulation. So again, we think that's probably one of the more, well, in terms of legislation, one of the most effective in really driving companies to do the work that needs to be done to identify their exposure and then address those business relationships where they can. So I think I'll just pause there because I realize I've been going on for a while. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. It's just really interesting to hear how let down we've been by the Modern Slavery Act and how this is just an issue that's so close to home and it's on our shelves and consumers aren't safe from forced labor. So it's really fascinating. We're going to move on to the Q&A section now. And so feel free to be writing questions in the chat box, or if you want to raise a hand, then